Hello, and welcome to Ethics on Call, the podcast of the Center for Theology and Ethics in Catholic Health. I'm Dan Daly.
And I'm Tom Bushlack.
And today we're going to talk about Pope Francis's theology and moral perspective and make some connections to Catholic healthcare. So, Tom, how's it going today? Are you ready for our second podcast?
Yeah, excited to be back. Excited that we're up live on all the streaming channels and grateful for all of you tuning in. Glad to be with you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you to all the listeners for being with us. So, Tom, can you just tell us a little bit about why we chose this topic? Why this topic? Why now? It probably is in some ways obvious to the audience, given the death of Pope Francis, but it also goes beyond that. So we had been thinking about this even before he passed away.
Yeah, we had. And this, like you said, it goes back. We were already starting to reflect on the influence of Pope Francis's life and witness and writings and thinking. And that was partly inspired by a visit that we had during the Theology and Ethics Colloquium that was hosted by the Catholic Health Association that we attended along with a lot of mission and ethics leaders in Catholic healthcare. And we had just a brilliant presentation by Connor Kelly, professor of theological ethics at Marquette. And he kind of gave a rundown of what are the trends happening in theology and ethics and how do they relate to Catholic healthcare. He covered a lot in that presentation, but he talked in particular a lot about the influence that Pope Francis has had on the discourse. And of course, he was also highlighted his own work and book that we'll be referencing, an edited volume that he co-edited with Kristen Hare, who's your colleague there at Boston College. And just reflecting on the influence that he's had on the discourse of ethics and theology, and particularly within the U.S. context that was focused on. So we were already kind of thinking about that. One of the things that he highlights in the intro, or they highlight in the intro, is that Pope Francis was not trained primarily as an academic the way his two predecessors were, and that the way they put it in the intro is that his moral theology almost has to be reverse engineered from what he said and did in more pastoral or episodic contexts. So that's part of what we'll unpack here today. So we were already thinking that, and then of course Pope Francis became very ill and passed away the day after Easter. So that sort of inspired us to think, yeah, this would be a great time to reflect upon his moral vision, the influence it's had, and then, of course, think creatively about what that means for the Catholic health tradition and how that's applied in practice.
Yeah.
Anything you would add to that narrative?
Oh, I think you really nailed it. I think it was both. We were already thinking about this and trying to bring this to the ministry through the podcast, and Connor's presentation was just lights out and got a lot of people excited about the book, about reflecting on Francis. And so it was it was an easy call for us to make to have this second podcast on this topic. So, Tom, as we've discussed this, we decided to take a thematic approach here, and we'll kind of go back and forth. What's the first theme that you identify that you'd like to raise up for our listeners?
Yeah, thanks for getting us started. So the first one that came out to me is less of a kind of intellectual point, though I think it ties into them. But I've honestly had a bit of a personal slash professional conversion, just taking the time to reflect on Francis's writings, and then of course some of the secondary commentaries that we've been reading upon it. And it's come at an interesting time. So, I stepped out of the academic world for a while and worked in healthcare, doing ethics committees, ethics consults, working in mission integration, doing a lot of formation. So I wasn't tracking things academically in quite the same way. I just didn't have the time to keep up with things. Unlike you did with your book, where you had a chance to read all this and comment on it. And so it's kind of like playing catch up a little bit at the end of Francis's life. And one of the things that has really moved me is the way in which he witnessed through, like, where he placed himself physically and the way he showed up. And so for him, ideas are important, But I think, as he says in Let Us Dream, ideas can be debated, but realities are discerned. And he was very interested in showing up in places, and placing his body at the margins. So the things he did, like calling the world meeting of popular movements and addressing them directly, and even some of the images that stood out to me during his papacy that some of the listeners are probably familiar with. There's some famous pictures of him embracing a very disfigured man who came up to him in St. Peter's Square during from a crowd, um, or an image that I remember seeing early on of him, and I can't remember what media it was in, but he insisted that the Vatican part of the Vatican wing would be open to serve homeless people living on the streets of Rome. And not only did he insist that that be done, but then he spent time there. So I just have this image of him sitting on the curb, on the wing of St. Peter's Square, sipping on a mate drink, which is a traditional Argentinian drink that he enjoyed, just like hanging out with homeless people, and being present to them. And we'll talk more later about, the ways he integrates that into theological reflection. But that's one of the first things that stands out to me is that, and I bring this into the work that we're doing as a center, is, how do we place ourselves at the margins and make sure that we're listening to those voices, that we're not just kind of giving intellectual answers from a distance, but that we're engaged in the work of healthcare and the actual delivery to patients and families and communities. So that's kind of my first thought. That's more of a thematic kind of reflection.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one of the things that I really that as I go back through his corpus, and just think about his life and his papacy, um, the way that he does moral theology, if you wanna say that, he is doing a certain kind of moral theology
Mhm.
here again, as you noted, he's not a moral theologian in terms of training, but there is a moral theology present in his work, certainly, is that he does it through, he first of all, he thinks about the moral life often in terms of virtue, right? Character traits.
Mhm.
It's not that he dismisses principles or rules or anything of that nature. It's certainly there, but he often thinks of the moral life through the virtues. You can think of Laudato Si, where he's inviting us to new habits and cultivating new virtues like moderation and sobriety, humility, all of these kind of virtues. But then even more striking as you go through his corpus and you think about his life is he often thinks about the moral life in terms of exemplars, moral
Mhm.
exemplars, the embodiments of goodness, the embodiments of virtue. So not just the concept, but the embodiment. And there's a great book behind me by a guy by the name of Mark Jordan entitled Teaching Bodies, and it's on Aquinas' Summa. And he basically says what you should do is read the Summa backwards. Start with the third part,
Mm.
read the second part, and then read the first. And the reason he invites us to read the book in that way is you begin with the exemplar. And he says, no one reads the third part, and it's all about Jesus. And he's the exemplar. And in fact, Aquinas does his moral theology in many ways in that direction as well. Here he's culminating with the exemplar. But one of the points that Jordan makes that will always stick with me is embodied creatures need an embodied moral pedagogy.
Mm.
We're embodied creatures. We need an embodied moral pedagogy. We need exemplars. We can't dispense with exemplars. And I think more than any pope that I've seen before him, he points to exemplars. He points to the saints. We see this really throughout his writings. I would invite readers, if you haven't had a chance to read his last encyclical, Delixit Nos, on the heart, on having a heart that's enkindled by charity. Take a look at that encyclical. And there you'll find that throughout the encyclical, he's pointing to the embodiments of goodness. St. Margaret Mary, St. Francis de Sales. He's just throughout the document, it's just a litany of saints and discussing how they have a heart that is dedicated to God and loving others. And one of the things that we've talked about, Tom, is not just that he does that in his writings, but to the very point you make that he himself is an exemplar. right? His moral teaching is both on the page and in his person. And I think we've all been moved by that, by the integrity of his life in terms of his right now. He wasn't a perfect man, there, he certainly not, and he admitted that as such. The first statement he made about himself is that he's a sinner. So I'm not, you can be an exemplar and still have flaws and be a sinner. We know this, right? The saints aren't perfect. Um, they dedicate their lives to their love of God and neighbor, and I think we see that in him as well, but certainly reflected in his writing. And that's one of those kind of takeaways and themes that I think is just so, it's a real contribution. And I think when we think about this in Catholic health, many systems do this. I know you, as a former mission leader, you did this all the time. You would raise up the foundress, in terms of formation, that you're pointing to that embodiment of goodness. And I think we can certainly do more of this in moral theology and Catholic health and elsewhere, to look at those embodiments of goodness.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny, I'd kind of forgotten about that moment when he first came out on the balcony. I have a pretty vivid memory of that. And he said, I'm a sinner. And his first words were to ask everyone to pray for him, instead of like giving a blessing, which of course he did, but he asked for it first. And that is a beautiful exemplar. And I'm thinking of a couple of some of his concrete actions, right? Like where he chose to shine a light. Our program coordinator manager, Debbie Rahab, gave us a couple of examples of persons that he initiated the beatification process for, who were kind of, like needed modern examples that seem very accessible. Um, so she mentioned Blessed Carlos Acutis and Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, both of whom were very engaged in the modern world, but attentive to the needs of the poor and people who are excluded. And of course, he placed himself in those same places. So yeah, I think there is a powerful piece in that. Something else that you said that brought up a thought for me is, you talked about you didn't use this word, but we've talked elsewhere about the importance of engaging the passions and the affections and the body, because those are part of the body, especially the passions. And there is a certain kind of theological tradition that's maybe more stoic informed, that says, you need to overcome the passions or get rid of them for the sake of the intellect or purity of thought. But the weight of the tradition, and certainly what Francis and Thomas Aquinas and others taught, is the embodied version, which is, you don't overcome the passions, you feel them and you allow them to be oriented toward the good, towards God, towards love of neighbor, love of self. And I wonder if, you talked about Delixit Nos, emphasizing the heart, and that, is there anything in those writings that you think are particularly important for how we think about how we do moral theology, particularly in healthcare today?
Oh, absolutely. I think, it's so Ignatian kind of what he does there. He writes about the heart, yeah, and about our desire, but getting at the heart, the very core of the person, and what we're ultimately after. And yeah, to your point, Tom, certainly there, um, again, in a very Ignatian way, engaging the fullness of the person. I mean, Ignatius was a master of engaging the imagination and the desires, right? Like ferreting out the desires, discerning our desires. Um, and that's really reflected there. It's one of those pieces, I think, it came out, I think, in October of 2024. Um, and it really deserves to be read. It's a beautiful reflection on, an aspect that doesn't get discussed as much. It's kind of this combination of the moral life and the spiritual life. And
Yeah.
theologically, we've seen a lot of growth in that, talking about the connection of the moral and spiritual life over the past 30 or so years. Um, but the intervention that Francis develops into Licit Nos certainly takes that to another level. And so it's something that I think, even it's a document that even can be prayed over in a way.
Mm.
So yeah, it's if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, those of you who are listening, if you have a chance, please do.
So something you said in there brought me to what was actually one of my top 2 or 3 points for this section, and it's the way that Francis brought discernment into the moral life, which is a very Ignatian thing, as you just noted. Saint Francis Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Excuse me, that was a Freudian slip. Saint Ignatius of Loyola really emphasized or kind of considered the modern master of discernment. And Pope Francis, was the first Jesuit pope, as most people probably know, but it bears repeating. So he was formed in that particular way, and he really integrates that concept of discernment, of paying attention to kind of what are the movements of the spirit, both interiorly, internally, and externally. You mentioned that I did a lot of formation and work as a mission leader, and one of the things that we talked about in trying to teach discernment to executives and leaders who were making, high level decisions about these multi-billion-dollar ministries that are affecting millions of lives in America every year, was we actually used some of Pope Francis's. He has this catechesis on discernment. It was a series of his Wednesday reflections. I forget what he called them. Uh, and it would kind of each week he would go a little bit deeper. And he talks about paying attention to the movements of the spirit that are happening within our own heart. It's those affections and passions and desires. What feels maybe off or like, oh, this isn't quite going where we want it to, is can be a sign, a desolation of where we need to bring some discernment, or what feels really good that we need to lean into and do more of. And teaching people that are making leadership decisions in healthcare and practitioners at the bedside, how to tune into that and bring that into meeting people in their concrete lives. And that really, I think, you and I agree that we read Francis with that eye of continuity. He might have emphasized things in a slightly different way or had a different approach compared to some of his predecessors, but we see them as essentially kind of, along the same trajectory and developing. And in that sense, he was wanting to uphold that part that is powerful about the Catholic moral tradition, is that there's such a thing as objective moral truth that we can know, right? But then bringing discernment into that also adds this layer of that moral truth is only actionable. It only becomes prudential wisdom when it's interpreted through a lived experience. And we see that coming up in the things like in Amoris Laetitia, his reflection on the family and marriage, right, where he talks about what he calls irregular situations, and taking seriously people who, for often for reasons that aren't their own fault, aren't living up to that objective ideal, and how do we really take seriously that people are living faithfully while not being perfect, which frankly is all of us. But bringing that discernment in, whether it's an ethics consult in a committee, or with a provider and a patient and a family, or some of those bigger picture questions about how does the church as a whole respond to people who are divorced and or remarried, right, that are still wanting to be part of the church. He really took that seriously while remaining true to that tradition. So yeah, how do that piece about discernment, is that how do you relate that to virtue or maybe to prudence in particular? Because I think that's where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Tom. And your comments remind me, and I'll tie into to those as well. A chapter in the book that the Moral Vision of Pope Francis by Kelly and Heyer, that Andrea Vicini wrote,
Mm.
in which he discusses a discerning bioethics. That essentially the perspective is that Francis is inviting us to is a more discerning bioethics, and he reminds us to center that discernment on the person of Jesus and his teaching. Right, so it's a gospel centered, gospel centric discernment. The question is, do we do this? How do we do this? The discernment has to be in community with others. It's not just kind of an individualistic kind of a thing, as he notes. It's
Mhm.
always in community, but it's with Jesus as well. And we could think about this in our own lives. We can think about this in Catholic health. Do we discern with Jesus? Do we discern with the Gospels? Um, who and what are we consulting as we discern? And I think the point that Vicini makes is that Francis centers Jesus in that discernment,
Mhm.
and I think that's a really it's decentering from ourselves and decentering maybe even from the exact work we're being called to do at the moment toward Jesus, and to center that discernment on Jesus will then illumine uh, the best path, the correct path, um, the virtuous path. And certainly, I think, yeah, when we talk about discernment, we're in the this is an application. This is the moral life, not as mathematics, but as prudence, right? That only the prudent person can figure out the way forward, given the good goal. I mean, sometimes we have to discern the goal. What's the goal in this case? And other times we have to discern the means, right? We're discerning both. Um, in different ways, for Francis. But I think, I mean, that to me is an enormously beneficial part of his contribution to moral theology, is really raising up discernment as a practice, uh,
Mhm.
that we to get us away from a little bit of the kind of the ethics as math, more to the ethics as much more reflective and discerning.
Yeah, there's a great line from that Andrea Vicini chapter that you mentioned where he says, "What for Francis, what is complex can be discerned." And that the beauty of, like, say, the intellectual rigor of the tradition, is that it helps us enter into that complexity of discerning real life situations. And I love that you highlighted the kind of Christocentric or Jesus-centered aspect of that. Another piece that stood out for me in rereading some of his documents and some of the commentaries on it is there's also that sense in which Jesus comes to us through the other, right? Through the neighbor. And so there's a very person-centric approach that starts, you can start with sort of an abstract ideal and then be like, well, this person in front of me doesn't live up to that. Well, that's true for all of us, frankly, except for Jesus and Mary. But right. Or you can say, yes, we have this ideal, but then start with where the person is. And again, I think when he approaches like a both a pastoral and a theological reflection on, again, to reference Amoris Laetitia, those irregular situations, or even, you know, another important document that came out during his papacy was Dignitas Infinita, which he didn't write himself, but was published by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. Make sure I say that right. And part of what's unique about that document that we've talked about is that there's a cover letter by I forget the cardinal's name, who is the head of the dicastery, but it basically says, the original draft was sent back by Pope Francis and asked to kind of be further expanded upon. And the initial draft was focused on care of transgender persons and addressed some of Francis's concern about gender ideology, which he kept and added to and reflected upon. But it's very clear in there that even when dealing with these tricky situations where the tradition is still working itself out, about how is Catholic healthcare going to respond to these things, that he centers the person, you know. We take the person and their reality seriously first, and then we deal with, the intellectual part of that. And again, I think that's where maybe taking it back down to the practical level, when I was involved with ethics consults, you have the ERDs and you have the principles, but absent the concrete situation and, even going into the patient's chart and knowing what's happening, we don't know what to do until we discern through that lived experience. I brought up several different documents and points in there that kind of highlight anything for you that you're thinking about.
Yeah, Tom, I think I really appreciate you bringing in Dignitas Infinita because I mean, first of all, my take on that document is I think that's one of the most important documents of his papacy. I think it's a landmark document. It will be read and studied for a long time. And one of the reasons is that the the Catholic tradition now for, many decades has hung a lot of its positions on the notion of human dignity. Right? It's kind of said, these things are permissible or impermissible based on the fact that they either promote or undermine human dignity. But, I'm fond of saying it's a concept that's often used and rarely defined, or at least it had been. What Dignitas does for us is I think it builds upon the good work of a lot of theologians, like I think especially of Darlene Fozard Weaver, who wrote on this a number of times on developing a typology of dignity, and then you see that reflected in Dignitas, where they have this typology. There's ontological dignity, there's moral dignity, there's social dignity, there's existential dignity, and we begin to control those terms so that we're no longer vulnerable to the critique that was leveled for ages. I think of an article that Steven Pinker, who's at Harvard, wrote entitled "The Stupidity of Dignity."
Oof.
In there, Pinker writes basically that the concept of dignity, especially as Catholics have developed it, is too squishy. It's not up to the heavyweight demands that we make of it. We're building, we're we're developing all of these kind of positions. We're making these arguments based on dignity, but does anyone know what it means? And at the time, I had to concede he's got something there.
Mhm.
There's something true about the argument. I think I ultimately disagree with where he goes with it, but we had a concept that was not controlled enough. And I think again, through the good work of some theologians, and then Francis pushing us to think more about this, right? As you note, he was involved in the editing process and um, in the outlining of it, right? He said, go back and do more on dignity as a concept. And I think that work is incredibly helpful. It's incredibly important. I think that dignity is one of the it not only informs how Catholics think about the moral life, and Catholic healthcare, but it's one of the most important, contributions that Catholicism can make to the secular sphere, right? As we look at war, as we look at famine, as we look at, any number of things going on in the world, that we can make an argument based on this ontological, intrinsic, transcendent value that each human person has beyond all circumstances, as Pope Francis wrote in Fratelli Tutti, and then used that line in Dignitas Infinita. Um, Regardless of the circumstances of a person's life, regardless of whether or not they have committed a crime, or regardless of their immigration status, regardless of their age, their sex, their gender, each of us. Um, is equal in this way and this way only. We all image God equally. We are all equally valuable. I cannot think of a contribution that his pontificate made in the in terms of the world that's greater than that. Not only in this document, but really throughout. He embodied that throughout his papacy and his other documents get at this. But what Dignitas does is really helps us to control the terms so that we can say this is what we mean by dignity in its different
Mhm.
forms. So, you know, one of the things that makes me think of, Tom, that you've been talking about lately, though, is when you were going back into his writings, that you saw that one of the things that he did a number of occasions is really call us to not just listen to persons who are vulnerable or marginalized, but to have a different kind of relationship with them. I don't know if that's something you want to get into, and it just this focus on dignity in persons who, I mean, we talk about dignity more than anything because so many people are denied a life that's befitting a human, whether they're
Yeah.
poor, whether they're persecuted in some way because of some identifier they have. I don't know if you want to talk about that because you've been kind of keyed in on that the last few weeks when we've been talking about this.
Yeah, I have. Thank you. And you're right. It takes the concept of dignity, which can be abstract and sort of universalized, and makes it concrete. Now I'm forgetting which writing it's in, but he references, well, I think it's in Dignitas Infinitas, so not in Francis's writing per se, where they reference the UN Declaration on Universal Human Rights, right? Where the concept of dignity becomes concretized in daily life. And the other piece, that has really kind of struck me, and I mentioned this briefly before, is that Pope Francis, starting in 2014, called this world meeting of popular movements together and brought together grassroots organizers from all over the globe concerned about all those different issues that relate to human dignity. They're listed in Dignitas Infinita and that he highlights throughout his papacy. Um, and in his very first address to that group in 2014, he uses this phrase, and then it gets picked up by some other folks, where he says that, you are, and by you, he means people who are more traditionally marginalized or excluded or experiencing economic poverty or lack of access to power. I'm going to read the quote directly. He says, "You want to be protagonists." I love that word. You get organized, study, work, issue demands, and above all, practice that very special solidarity that exists among those who suffer, among the poor, and that our civilization seems to have forgotten or would strongly prefer to forget. And that word, inviting uh, folks who are traditionally excluded from power to become protagonists of their own work. Again, I read this with continuity. While I think it extends many aspects of Catholic social teaching that have already been moving in that way, and I take that to heart as the work that we do as a center, right? Essentially, a think tank for theology and ethics and Catholic health. That we don't just want to be sort of issuing things from outside and from observers or from our ivory tower and saying, hey, this is the way to do it. We want to be in the dialogue and in conversation with people. And it ties back to something that we were talking about earlier. We were talking about prudence. There's prudential wisdom or judgment is, there's an intellectual component to that of like knowing what's to be done. And I think it's Lisa Cahill that really highlights this in her chapter in the book that we were referencing before, that that prudence is both intellectual and relational at the same time. And the relational component is to bring in those core concepts from the tradition of mercy, compassion, charity, and I mean that in the broader sense. Not charity is just like giving alms to the poor, but that Latin caritas or the Greek agape, that universal love of God for all beings. So it's only in relationship that our ideas become discerned into reality, where we actually live them as we accompany people through their work. And again, I don't know, it ties back into your moral exemplarism, the embodiment component of all of that.
Yeah. And as you're talking, you mentioned talked a little bit about virtue earlier, and we maybe can return to that. But
Hmm.
it also makes me think about, when he was addressing that group, the popular movements and inviting them to be protagonists in their own liberation. Um, it also reminds me of the fact that when Francis, as I went back through his corpus, and this goes back years, but as I've been going through his corpus, one of the things that he continually returns to is indifference to suffering.
Mm,
And he really considers it to be, I think, the central moral pathology of our time. We just don't care. I mean, in some ways, it goes to Lixit Nos, like care. Let's care about things. Let's have a heart that is moved, that desires the good for ourselves and others, desires God. But we seem to not care. It's more of a lack of care than it is, intentional malice that we have for others. I mean, certainly that exists, but I don't think he thinks that that's the primary moral pathology, that we're evil, that we, that we're, misanthropic. I don't think that's the central vice. The vice is that we ignore, it's that we're the priest and Levite on the road. And we're not the good Samaritan. We walk past because we have something else to do. And he returns to that continually in his writings. And you mentioned mercy and just the centrality of mercy. We're all familiar with the centrality of mercy in his papacy, and not only in his writings, but in his coat of arms, in his Jubilee Year of Mercy, which was 2015-16. Right, a real focus on mercy. That's the solution to this moral pathology. The medicine is mercy.
Mm.
That's what will heal us, is that we begin to suffer with others in order to heal them of whatever suffering they're, so that certainly people who are on the underside of history should be protagonists in their own liberation. And those of us who are not marginalized should should listen, but also practice mercy to those who are, right? We have an obligation too. He's not burdening the already marginalized. He's calling for, and you just noted this with prudence, a relationship, like an accompaniment, a
Mhm.
walking with. Sometimes we need to lift the person onto the animal and take him to the hospital. Other times we need to walk with. And I think, his profound reflections on mercy and how much he elevates that as a virtue. Very, very Thomistic, as you know. We both wrote dissertations on Aquinas, and he even goes back to the Secunda Secundae 30, Article 4, where he writes of um, that that mercy is, in terms of external works, is the greatest of all the virtues,
Mm.
because it lives charity out in a way that is absolutely essential for the Christian, right? That Jesus embodies. I mean, Jesus is always doing the works of mercy. That interiorly, charity has primacy, right? And then it's externalized into mercy. And our audiences are people in Catholic healthcare, and I can't think of something that more connects to the work that people do in Catholic health every day. It is a work of mercy, right? We see it
Yeah.
in Matthew 25, those who care for or nurse the sick. Some have said that translation is really, that, I was sick and you nursed me. Um, so I know this is circuitous in a way, but your connection to mercy here is really profound, I think. And, yeah, again, makes me kind of look back with appreciation to how he lived and what he wrote.
Yeah. It's reminding me, I'm pretty sure it's in Evangelii Gaudium, one of his first writings, that he talks about that we are called to be evangelized by the poor. That as opposed, right, it sort of flips the traditional way. It's like, oh, I'm privileged, so I'm going to go serve the poor. And he's like, no, no, no. You need to be evangelized to see them as human persons with intrinsic dignity, to see Christ in them so that you can be saved. And then to work together, to create a world where that dignity can be honored. And this actually, I think, ties to one of the other things that I've heard you reflecting on a lot recently, is that point about his analysis of social structures and how those relate to the moral life. And what I think is interesting about the way the conversation has flowed into this is, mercy, we tend to think of as more of like that individual sort of virtue, right? It's care or nursing for those who need our care. And Catholic healthcare in the United States, developed as a direct response to need. Every story you go to, I don't care what ministry or system, it was a story of usually sisters seeing a need in the local community and responding out of mercy. But then as that response has continued, it's grown into this structure that now makes up roughly 20% of the US healthcare system. And Francis is very attentive to the interplay between kind of personal virtue and or vice and structures, and how structures maybe either limit or make possible certain responses or certain ways of being. So, yeah, do you want to reflect a little bit on his contributions and how that matters for what Catholic healthcare does in our context?
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. And I think, you see his focus on structure. You see it really clearly in Laudato Si. And this is where Tom Massaro's chapter in the Moral Vision book, Massaro talks about Francis having a structural eye. His eye is toward the structures. He's always looking at structure and how structure is either promoting human dignity or undermining it. In many ways, it's really reminiscent of John Paul's work on structure, right? He really is the first pope to give to spill a lot of ink on structure. He writes about the structures of sin. Um, you see that work certainly reflected in Pope Francis as well. Um, one of the things that I see Francis doing is he pushes that and he develops it in this direction. He calls for structural moral solutions to structural moral problems.
Mm.
So it's not just an individualistic. It's the solution to the ecological crisis, Tom, is not that you and I just become better and everyone who listens. Now, that needs to happen. And that speaks to our own personal virtue. I invite everyone to consume less and, all of those things. And pointing the finger at myself, first and foremost. Um, all of those things are good. And he says all of those things are necessary, but we should not mistake those actions as a solution. We do need structural solutions because he, more than any pope that I had really seen before, understands just how much structures influence human well-being. Um, that structures can cause poverty. That's actually, he writes of this. There are structural causes of poverty. There are structural causes of the ecological crisis. So individual action alone won't address these crises, whether it's let's bring it back to healthcare. Individual physicians, nurses, mission leaders, ethicists, CEOs can't solve the healthcare crisis. They can do good, they can promote well-being, they can certainly make differences in people's lives, but they can't solve that overall crisis.
Right.
The crisis of access to healthcare in this country can only be solved collectively. We need to change structure. Um, and so we can't think that we're going to do this alone. We have to do this together. And certainly, you just noted we have this enormous uh, percentage of healthcare in this country is provided by Catholics. We have power to do this. To make, we can't do it again. We can't do it alone. We need to do this in coalitions. We need to do this prudentially using political prudence and other good virtues in the political sphere. Um, but we're also called to that, not just to our own kind of the work that we do in our own, whether it's the center or systems or a hospital or in our own exam room, whoever we may be, but to contribute to that structural change. And CHA has done great work on this. Catholic Health, as in general, has done great work on this. And I think um, the work is unending, right? And he is calling us to be engaged in that structural transformation in a really profound way. Uh, so yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. I think it's an important point, and it's important for us to think not only in terms of our individual actions, but also in terms of what we do structurally. And one thing that he did that he picked up from Pope Benedict XVI. If you go back to Caritas and Veritate, Benedict XVI says there are essentially two ways we can live out our charity, our love of God and love of neighbor. One is the micro way. We do this interpersonally, right? You with your family, with friends, with neighbors, even strangers, one on one. Benedict writes, we can also do this on a macro level. We can do this, he calls this the institutional path of charity. So that the executive sitting in his office or the physicians, on committees, um, the mission leader in her work can do this when she's in a boardroom or she's in front of her computer, right? We can live out our love of God through our work in shaping institutions and structures. And I think it's good to be reminded of that. It doesn't have to be direct care. Just because you're not providing that direct care doesn't mean you're not living out that love of God and neighbor. Um, because structures actually do influence people's lives, well-being, their social dignity. If you go back to Dignitas Infinita, how they're treated. So, yeah, his work on structure, I think, is really important, and I'm glad you mentioned it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just as an example, if we think about Catholic healthcare in particular, let's just say, yeah, 20% of US healthcare, let's just say, which of course is not true, but if we could imagine that Catholic healthcare had as many resources as it possibly could have, which is utterly false. I've worked there. I know that they are extremely constrained. The margins are extremely narrow, and just if current trends politically continue, that's going to get worse because there's going to be fewer people with coverage who are able to be reimbursed. But even if we had unlimited resources and met every need, we would not be able to provide, you know, coverage for every person in the United States, even every citizen. Like, just if we bracket the question of migrants and immigrants, right? Um, so yeah, there is a sense in which we have to be engaged in those in advocacy work and those broader questions of overcoming. I think it's in Fratelli Tutti where Francis calls it a globalized indifference that you were talking about before, that there's a moral, spiritual blindness or lack of willingness to have the courage that it would take to care enough to do the work, because it's going to be a lot of work to address some of these inequities in our culture and take quite a bit of goodwill. And that reminds me of another point that, Pope Francis, he really lived joyfully. Like, I mentioned some of the images that stand out, and there's one of him just like sitting in the middle of a crowd where I think he was probably talking to somebody and just laughing like gut. You can tell it's just this gut laugh coming out. Like, he is just joyfully present amidst that. And one of the things that he also did, and I forget, one of the commentators that we read in the book says you can also notice as much about what he stood for by what he doesn't say or engage with. And he really did not engage with any kind of culture wars approach to things,
Yeah.
right? He wanted to witness to the joy of living the gospel in the world and less concerned about critique and criticism and telling people why they're wrong, and more focus on beauty and calling people into, a joyful life of being connected to each other, of practicing mercy and solidarity. Um, and there's something to that again, I think I know that you and I and in the center, we want to embody that as well, of not getting dragged into arguments about who's right, who's wrong. Of course, we're going to have our opinions and our statements and take positions and stands and be courageous about that. But there's a way of doing that that invites people into, instead of excluding and criticizing, that I think is really important. I don't know if you've reflected more on how we do that going forward.
Yeah, I think, I think you're right. Uh, in a culture war, the idea is that you defeat the other, right? That you win. Wars are fought to be won. Um, he's not looking to defeat anyone. He's looking to convert. And how do you convert people? And he actually writes this, that, and I forget the exact place that he says this, but that the church grows more by attraction than, it might be Evangelii Gaudium. The
I'm
church
pretty sure it
grows
is.
more by attraction than anything else. And to your point about joy, I mean, he was an incredibly attractive figure. His joy, the joy that he lived, his life, his Christian vocation, um, attracted people to him, attracted people to God. Right? We evangelize each other. We show each other God. I mean, we're a sacramental religion, and we must. The only way that the church grows is through um, God's grace, working in and through others. It's a communal faith. Um, and I think you're absolutely right. And so I think, as we think about the work that we do, when we think about Catholic healthcare and ethics and theology, um, yeah, I think the best arguments are the arguments that attract people to the good. And that's again, this ties back into this kind of exemplar piece. Exemplars, again, they show us what to do and they make us want to be like them.
Hmm.
Um, they to get back to something you talked about earlier, desire, the heart, the passions, the affections. We want those moved so that we're drawn to the good. Certainly, there are tragic situations in which ferreting out the good is incredibly difficult, and we deal with those as we have to. But the majority of decisions that we make, whether it's in our personal moral lives or as people in Catholic health, don't have to do with intrinsic evils. They have to do with how do we live into the healing ministry of Jesus Christ even more, to an even greater degree. And I think that's where the attractiveness of someone like Francis, or the attractiveness of Jesus, the attractiveness of the saints draws us to the good, um, in a way that, there's no other way to really grow in the good than by being drawn toward it. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, it's a great point, Tom, and I think
Yeah.
it's one that deserves even more reflection. Anything else, Tom? Anything else you wanted to get in? I don't know if there were points you wanted to raise or things you want to return to as we
Yeah.
towards closing.
I was going to ask you the same thing, but one thing that came up for me as we've been talking that brought me way back to because Laudato Si came out, was it 2015, I believe, and I was still doing more classroom teaching then, and so I remember using that in the classroom. But one of the things that I loved about Laudato Si was he wove in a very Ignatian kind of we talked about discernment, but he wove in a very Ignatian kind of contemplation into it as well, where and it actually relates to what we were just talking about, which is people are attracted to what they see as beautiful. And I don't know anybody who's been had a major conversion experience by somebody pointing out that they were engaged in intrinsic evil. Like, oh, shoot, you got me. Like, um, even Jesus didn't really do that, right? Like the woman caught in adultery, he didn't even condemn her. He didn't need to. It had already been done, socially. Um, but that call to he talks about like contemplating the beauty of nature and seeing the harmony and the balance of the divine will that's reflected in ecosystems that can lead to a kind of moral conversion. And then when you combine that with some of the things that we've talked about here of telling the stories about the founders and foundresses and the way that they responded to the needs in their community, and continuing today, the way we tell the story of how Catholic healthcare continues to respond to the immense needs that in our communities today and in our local community all the way up to the national level. That is something that I think moves people and it brings their spirituality into it, whatever background they might come from, to sort of really like contemplate what is the good that I want in this life and how does my vocation, whether that's as a provider and I'm doing direct care or I'm a patient access coordinator or I'm cleaning rooms or, all the way up to, middle managers and vice presidents and C-suite executives, there's something that moves people to be called into this ministry. And I think the more we can uphold the beauty of that, the more courage we're going to have to take those social stances that maybe are going to make us not so popular or cut across our self-identified political commitments. We've talked about how and this is not new to Francis. Catholic social teaching has always had critical things to say to whatever end of the spectrum you happen to fall on, or even if you're in the middle of the spectrum. It's if it's not challenging you, then we're probably not paying attention. Um, but without getting mired down in the stone throwing that tends to happen. So yeah, there's something there that I think is powerful for us to be able to institutionalize in Catholic healthcare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you were talking, the talking about this kind of the drive toward the good, and it really makes me think in the end as I kind of went back through, especially I think later on in his papacy, he emphasizes it maybe even a little bit more than earlier. The centrality of grace in the moral life.
Oh yeah.
He and Connor Kelly makes this point in his excellent chapter on Francis and virtue, um, that we need to kind of recapture the notion of grace. You know, I when I teach, I always said, like, Pelagianism is the heresy that won't leave Catholics alone. We tend to think that we save ourselves, and there's a ledger, and it's my virtuous actions minus my sinful ones. And as long as there's more on the positive side, I'm saved. And that's not at all what Catholics believe about salvation, about the moral life, because it leaves out grace, right? This is not our moral lives are not individualistic achievements. They are cooperative. It's more like a team sport than it is like an individual sport. You succeed together. Um, and it's so Thomistic, he uh, saying that basically Jesus enables us to love as he loves. That's what charity is that we can love with God's love. Um, and we can reject that. We can be open to it. We can reject it. So, on a personal level, he writes about the fact that we need that kind of, we have a need for grace, right? Very Pauline. We're weak. We need grace. Um, but also in terms of, the ministry, this is a grace capacitated ministry. Catholic healthcare can't exist without God's grace. It would cease to be Catholic healthcare if it did. So, how do we think about that um, as we serve people in the ministry? What does it mean to be a ministry that is only possible due to God's grace, which, by the way, as we know, can move through all persons of goodwill. You don't have to be Catholic to be graced. And, you know, don't trust me on that. Go read Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 22, where God's grace moves through all persons of goodwill in ways that we can't understand or see. So, yeah, but just your point here really brings me back to like a foundational commitment that he has, the centrality of grace.
I don't know if I could think of a better point to end on. I don't know if you have other points that we didn't cover that you want to bring up, but as yeah, I think for as long as I have been involved with the healing ministry, Catholic healthcare as an extension of Jesus's healing ministry, there's always, there's just like endless challenges to keep that ministry going. And I think the foundresses that we have that made up those systems were, you know, they had like nothing. They lived poverty, and they just, said, "Hey, we need to open this house up as a hospital." And I love that you said how it's a team sport, and that team has both the communitarian and the transcendent dimension. It's like we're in this together, not just as Catholics, not even just as Christians, but as people of goodwill. Wanting to extend that healing ministry, and we've got grace. We've got God on our side. That's not to say it's going to be easy. And we certainly don't know what the outcomes are, but at least that's a place to come back to when the work gets tiring and exhausting, and we have those moments where hope is hard to distill or keep flowing. We don't have to find it for ourselves. So that seems like a very fitting place to end. Any final thoughts from you?
No, no, that was great. I think, yeah, here we ended with hope. So I think that's a good place to end. Tom, I really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Super.
Well, for Tom Bushlack, I'm Dan Daly, and this has been Ethics on Call. You can find this podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and our website, theologyandethics.org/podcast. If you're on one of these podcast platforms, would ask that you follow or subscribe to our page and leave a 5-star review and some feedback about the show. Would love to hear from you. We'll talk to you soon.